All of these structures separated by thousands of miles, thousands of years, built by people who never met, never traded, never heard each other's languages, no phone lines, no shipping routes, no internet forums where Egyptian architects could swap blueprints with Mesoamerican engineers, and yet over and over again they arrived at the same essential form: stack stone or earth toward the sky. Make it big, make it last, make it a shape that dominates the horizon and refuses to be ignored. Why? That's the question that fuels 1,000 documentaries, internet rabbit holes, and late-night conversations about ancient mysteries. It's a genuine puzzle, not the kind that requires aliens or lost supercivilizations to solve, but the kind that reveals something fundamental about how humans think, build and reach for meaning when they look up at the stars or down at the earth beneath their feet. Now, let's be clear, not literally every ancient civilization built pyramids. The Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro built sophisticated urban grids and citadels, but no pyramids. Mycenaean Greece preferred palaces and tholos tombs. Plenty of complex societies chose other ways to make their mark. But the pattern is striking enough, widespread enough, and consistent enough that it demands explanation. Why did so many unconnected cultures, working with different materials, different gods, and different ideas about death and power, independently decide that the best way to build something eternal was to build it in this shape? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you right now? What time is it where you are? I love checking and seeing Singapore at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all listening to the same story about stones stacked by people who've been gone for thousands of years. This isn't going to be a mystery show that strips credit from the builders or pretends we know nothing. We know a lot, but what we know makes the question even more interesting. Let's start at the beginning. Before there were pyramids, there were mastabas, and before mastabas, there was the Nile. Picture Egypt around 3100 BCE. The river runs north through a narrow green corridor of life, flanked on both sides by rising desert that stretches empty and gold to the horizon. Every summer, like clockwork for thousands of years, the Nile floods. Water spills over the banks, deposits rich black silt across the fields, then retreats. The Egyptians plant, harvest, and live their lives on that thin strip of fertility. But when they die, they're carried west, up onto the high desert plateau where the floodwaters never reach, where the ground stays dry and the dead stay undisturbed. On that plateau, near the edge where desert meets cultivation, the first kings and elites of united Egypt built their eternal homes. Not pyramids, not yet. Mastabas, low rectangular platforms of mud brick, flat-topped maybe 3 or 4 meters high, built over deep vertical shafts that drop down into underground burial chambers. The word mastaba comes from the Arabic word for bench. That's what they looked like from a distance, big benches of brick sitting out on the empty sand. But they weren't simple. Even the earliest royal mastabas at Saqqara, built just after 3000 BCE, were massive. Some stretch nearly 60 meters long and 25 wide. Their exterior walls were decorated with elaborate niched facades that mimicked the architecture of royal palaces, row after row of recessed panels that played with light and shadow. The message was clear. This wasn't just a grave. This was a house, a palace for eternity. Inside, these structures were honeycombed with rooms, dozens of chambers packed with supplies, stone vessels by the thousands, tools, furniture, preserved food, beer jars, clothing, everything the dead might need in the next life. Some mastabas had offering chapels built into the superstructure, complete with false doors carved into the stone, doorways that existed only symbolically, so offerings of bread and beer and incense could pass through to nourish the spirit inside. because the Egyptians believed the person didn't end at death. They believed in the Ka, the life force that needed a dwelling and sustenance. They believed in the Bayar, the mobile soul that could fly out and return, but needed a physical anchor, a body or statue to come back to. Without a secure tomb, without offerings, without a name carved in stone, the dead could be erased, scattered, lost. The tomb wasn't just for remembrance, it was infrastructure. The engine that kept a person existing after their heart stopped beating. So mastabas grew, generation by generation, reign by reign. Mud brick gave way to stone, at least for the most important burials. The rooms multiplied. Storage magazines, serdabs, sealed chambers where stone statues of the deceased sat in the dark, connected to the outside world only through narrow slots so incense smoke and prayers could reach them. The enclosure walls around the mastabas got thicker, higher, more fortress-like. By the early 3rd dynasty, some of these structures dominated the desert skyline. You could see them for miles, and at some point someone had a thought. What if we didn't stop at one level? What if we stacked them? That's the impulse that will eventually create pyramids, but it didn't happen all at once. The shift from mastaba to pyramid wasn't a sudden lightning bolt of inspiration. It was incremental. A larger mastaba, then a mastaba stacked on top of another slightly smaller one, then another and another, each step an experiment. Each reign pushing a little higher, testing what stone could do, what workers could accomplish, what would make a tomb not just eternal but unmistakable. This is the part most people skip when they talk about pyramids. They jump straight to the finished monuments, the polished stones and perfect geometry. But the story starts here, in the slow escalation of mud and brick and human ambition on the edge of the desert. It starts with the idea that the dead deserve permanence, that a life, once lived, should leave a mark the earth can't erase. And here's what makes this so strange and so fascinating. That same idea, that same slow escalation from simple burial to monumental platform, happened again and again in cultures that never spoke to each other. We're going to see it in Mesopotamia, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, in places so far apart that the idea couldn't possibly have travelled, but somehow it did. Not through contact, through something else, something deeper. But first we need to watch that stack of mastabas become something nobody had ever built before. Around 2670 BCE, during the reign of King Djoser, a man named Imhotep changed everything. He wasn't a king. He was a vizier, a high official, chancellor of the Egyptian state. But he was also something rare, a polymath, architect, administrator, physician, sage. Later centuries would remember him as a healer and a genius. 1,000 years after his death, scribes would pour offerings to him before beginning their work. 2,000 years later, he'd be worshipped as a full god of wisdom and medicine, his cult spreading across Egypt and eventually merging with the Greek god Asclepius. But in his own lifetime, he was tasked with building a tomb for his king, and what he built became the first colossal stone structure in human history, the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, roughly 60 meters high, 6 massive tiers stacked like platforms ascending toward the sky, a shape the world had never seen before. But it didn't start that way. Archaeology tells us the design changed during construction, not once, multiple times. It started as a simple stone mastaba, square, maybe 8 meters tall, about 60 meters on each side. Substantial, but not revolutionary. Just a stone version of what had been built in mud brick for generations. Then, for reasons we can only infer, Imhotep or Djoser or both decided it wasn't enough. The mastaba was enlarged. Stone blocks added to extend it outward, making it bigger, heavier, more dominant on the plateau. Still not enough. The next phase went vertical. The square mastaba became a 4-step pyramid, each tier smaller than the one below, creating a staircase effect. Then, in the final iteration, 2 more steps were added. The structure grew asymmetrical, rectangular rather than square, with 6 distinct levels rising in diminishing tiers. The base stretched roughly 121 by 109 meters, the whole thing oriented east to west, its bulk pressing down on a labyrinth of chambers and corridors carved deep into the bedrock below. What this means is that Imhotep was improvising, experimenting in real time with millions of limestone blocks. There was no blueprint inherited from a previous era, no tradition of monumental stone architecture to draw on. Every decision, how to lay the courses, how to stabilize the structure, how high they could safely build, was being figured out as the work progressed. The blocks themselves were small, closer to mud bricks in size than the massive stones that would be used in later pyramids. They were laid in horizontal courses initially, then shifted to inward-leaning accretion layers that pressed toward the center, distributing weight and preventing collapse. This was engineering at the edge of what was possible, and it required more than just stone. The pyramid sits at the heart of a vast mortuary complex, roughly 40 acres enclosed by a limestone wall more than 10 meters high and over a mile in total length. That wall alone is staggering. Its outer face is carved with hundreds of niches, imitating the palace facade architecture of earlier mastabas but magnified to fortress scale. There are 14 gates carved into it. 13 are false, solid stone doorways that lead nowhere. Only one, tucked into the southeast corner, actually opens, and even that entrance is narrow, indirect, designed to funnel visitors through a long colonnade before revealing the open courtyard within. Inside the enclosure, the architects built an entire world in stone. Dummy chapels with carved false doors, ritual courtyards, a long rectangular space marked out as a said festival court, complete with stone platforms where the king was meant to perform his jubilee ritual, the ceremonial run that renewed his power and vitality, except Djoser wasn't supposed to run it in life. This was for his afterlife. The complex was a stage set for eternity, a place where priests could perform the necessary rites forever, feeding offerings through false doors, burning incense in serdabs, maintaining the cult that kept the king's spirit alive and active in the cosmos. Beneath the pyramid, the underworld begins. A vertical shaft drops down into bedrock, opening into a maze of corridors, galleries, and storage chambers that honeycomb the ground for hundreds of meters in every direction. Some passages are lined with blue faience tiles, gleaming ceramic meant to evoke water or the heavens. Others are carved with images of the king performing rituals, and in the magazines, the storage rooms, excavators found more than 40,000 stone vessels. Jars, bowls, plates carved from alabaster, schist, diorite, some of them inscribed with the names of kings from the first and second dynasties, ancestors who had died generations before Djoser was born. Why so many? Why vessels from earlier reigns? One theory is that Djoser was claiming continuity, linking himself to the royal dead, gathering their power and legitimacy into his own monument. Another is that these were simply valuable objects, prestige goods redistributed and reburied as offerings. Either way, the sheer volume is overwhelming, provisioning the afterlife on an industrial scale. And all of this, the pyramid, the enclosure, the underground galleries, the 40,000 vessels, required labour on a scale Egypt had never organised before. Quarrying limestone from nearby deposits and the massive trench dug around the complex, transporting millions of blocks, shaping and dressing them, laying them course by course, year after year, feeding the workers, housing them, coordinating teams of stonecutters, masons, haulers, overseers, priests, and administrators. This wasn't just architecture. This was state formation. The logistics of building the step pyramid effectively invented the bureaucratic and economic systems that would allow Egypt to build even larger pyramids in the decades to come. You can't move this much stone without record keeping, without ration distribution, without hierarchies of authority that could plan years in advance and compel or incentivize labor from across the kingdom. But why build upward at all? Why shift from the horizontal mass of a mastaba to the vertical leap of a pyramid? Scholars have offered several answers, and none of them cancel each other out. The steps could be a literal stairway, a physical mechanism for the king's spirit to ascend toward the circumpolar stars, the eternally visible, never-setting constellation the Egyptians associated with immortality. Or the form could represent accumulated power, a stack of mastabas signifying generations of royal authority compressed into a single monument. Some have suggested it's a stylized version of the primordial mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. In that reading, the pyramid is cosmic architecture. The king becomes the mound, his tomb the axis where earth touches eternity. The Egyptians themselves left no single explanation, and maybe that's the point. The step pyramid isn't a riddle with one answer. It's a statement so monumental that it holds multiple meanings at once. Tomb, temple, stairway, mountain, palace, engine of the afterlife cult. A machine made of stone to keep one man's name and spirit alive forever. And it worked. Djoser and Imhotep are still here, still remembered, 4,600 years after the last block was laid. But this was only the beginning, because once Egypt proved you could build a stairway to the stars, the question became, what if you made it smooth? Sneferu inherited a kingdom that knew how to build pyramids, but his father, Huni, had left him something else, a problem. Somewhere around 2600 BCE, construction was underway on a massive 7-step pyramid at Meidum, about 100 kilometers south of Saqqara. Whether it was Huni who started it, or Sneferu who began and then modified it, the archaeological record doesn't give us certainty. What we do know is that at some point, maybe midway through Sneferu's reign, someone made a bold decision. They would transform the stepped structure into a smooth-sided pyramid, filling in the terraces with packing blocks and encasing the whole thing in fine limestone. Then something went wrong. The outer casing collapsed. Maybe during construction, maybe shortly after completion. The exact timing is debated, but the result is unmistakable. Today, the Meidum Pyramid looks like a 3-tiered tower rising from an enormous mound of rubble, the broken remains of its smooth outer shell lying in heaps around the base. Somewhere in the transition from step pyramid to true pyramid, the engineering failed. The packing stones weren't bonded properly to the core, or the foundation couldn't support the added weight, or the angle was too steep. Whatever the cause, tons of limestone came crashing down, and Sneferu learned. At Dashur, about 40 kilometers north, he tried again. The pyramid that resulted is one of the strangest monuments in Egypt. The Bent Pyramid. It rises from the desert at a confident, aggressive angle of roughly 54 degrees, its lower courses climbing steep and sharp. Then, about halfway up at around 47 meters, the angle changes, abruptly. The slope shifts to a much gentler 43 degrees, giving the structure its distinctive broken profile as if the builders suddenly lost their nerve. They probably did. Not because of cowardice, but because of cracks. Most Egyptologists interpret the angle change as a response to structural instability discovered during construction. The steep lower slope was generating too much stress. The core blocks were shifting. Cracks appeared in the internal chambers. Rather than risk a catastrophic collapse like the one that may have already happened at Meidum, the architects made a real-time adjustment. They changed the angle, reduced the load, and finished the pyramid at a safer slope. This is trial and error on a monumental scale. A king commanding millions of man-hours and uncountable blocks of limestone, and his engineers are figuring out the physics as they go. The bent pyramid stands as a frozen record of that learning process, a visible scar where ambition met the limits of contemporary understanding and had to compromise. But Sneferu didn't stop. Less than 2 kilometers away, he started a third pyramid. This time, he applied everything learned from the previous failures. The Red Pyramid, named for the reddish limestone of its core, rises to about 105 meters, with a base stretching 220 meters on each side. Its slope is 43 degrees from bottom to top. No angle change, no structural drama. Just smooth, consistent geometry, ascending toward a capstone. This is Egypt's first successful true pyramid. The first time a royal tomb achieved the pure triangular form that would define the next century of construction. Sneferu's architects had finally solved the equation. They knew how to lay foundations deep enough to bear the weight, how to bond core and casing stones so the outer shell wouldn't shear away, how to angle the sides steeply enough to be visually dramatic but gently enough to remain stable. And then Sneferu died. His son Khufu inherited a kingdom that knew how to build the impossible. Around 2560 BCE, on the Giza Plateau overlooking the Nile Valley, construction began on what would become the largest pyramid ever successfully completed in ancient Egypt. The Great Pyramid, originally 146.5 meters tall, base covering more than 13 acres, each side roughly 230 meters long. An estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, most weighing between 2 and 15 tons, some of the granite blocks in the king's chamber exceeding 50 tons. The precision is staggering. The base is level to within about 2 centimeters across its entire length. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of about 3 arc minutes. This isn't rough approximation. This is deliberate, methodical engineering executed over decades with tools we'd consider primitive. Copper saws and chisels, stone hammers, wooden sledges and rope. No pulleys, no wheels for heavy transport, no iron. Inside, the layout becomes a vertical journey. The original entrance, hidden high on the north face, opens into a narrow descending passage that plunges down into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, ending in an unfinished subterranean chamber. But partway down, another passage branches upward. The ascending passage, barely a meter wide and just as tall, climbs at a steep angle through the pyramid's mass. Then it suddenly opens into the Grand Gallery, a corbelled corridor nearly 9 meters high and 47 meters long, its walls leaning inward in overlapping courses that distribute the weight of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. At the top of the Grand Gallery, a low passage leads into the king's chamber, a rectangular room lined entirely with red granite. In the western end sits a lidless granite sarcophagus, rough cut, undecorated, slightly too large to have been brought through the passages after the chamber was sealed. It was placed during construction, which means the entire pyramid was built around it. Above the king's chamber, 5 separate compartments called relieving chambers stack one on top of another, their ceilings formed by massive granite beams. The purpose is presumably structural, channeling the pyramid's weight away from the burial chamber below. But the topmost chamber contains something unexpected. Quarry marks. Graffiti left by the work gangs, red ochre inscriptions naming their teams. The crew, Khufu excites love. The followers of the powerful white crown of Khufu. Not the polished hieroglyphs of official inscriptions, but the rough scrawl of workers marking their stone. These men weren't slaves. The evidence keeps piling up. Workers' villages near Giza with housing, bakeries, breweries, graffiti naming teams with pride. Skeletal remains showing healed injuries, medical care, diets heavy in meat and bread. This was organized, rotating labor. Farmers working during the flood season when fields were underwater. Skilled masons brought in for specialist tasks. Perhaps 20 to 30,000 people at peak construction, fed and housed by a state apparatus that could mobilize resources across the entire kingdom. But how did they actually build it? The mainstream model involves ramps, straight ramps running up one face, or zigzagging ramps wrapping around the structure, or internal ramps spiraling up through the core, or some combination of all three depending on the height and phase of construction. Blocks quarried nearby or brought by boat from across the Nile, hauled on sledges, possibly with water poured on sand to reduce friction, lifted with levers, rocked into place, fitted and adjusted course by course. The broad strokes are clear, the details remain debated. No one has found definitive evidence of ramp configurations at Giza itself, though traces survive at earlier pyramids. How they raised the final courses 140 meters up, how they maneuvered 50-ton granite beams through narrow passages. These questions don't have universally accepted answers. Recently, muon tomography detected a large void above the Grand Gallery. Its purpose, if it has one, is unknown. And then there's the question of meaning. Why smooth sides instead of steps? The pyramid texts inscribed in later pyramids offer clues. Some spells describe the king ascending a stairway to join the stars. Others invoke the sun god Ra, whose rays pierce downward to earth. A smooth-faced pyramid, especially when covered in gleaming white limestone and capped with a gilded pyramidion, could represent both. A frozen sunbeam, the primordial Benben stone magnified to cosmic scale. The evolution from step to smooth tracks the rise of solar theology, Ra's cult absorbing older star-based beliefs into a unified royal afterlife cosmology. But the pyramid was never alone. Khufu's monument is surrounded by three smaller queen's pyramids to the east, long boat pits containing disassembled cedar ships, a causeway descending to a valley temple now lost beneath modern Cairo. Nearby, his son Khafra built a slightly smaller pyramid and the Great Sphinx. His grandson Menkaure added a third, completing the Giza triad. The plateau became a ritual landscape, a city of the dead where priests performed daily offerings, where the living came to petition the royal ancestors, where stone and ceremony maintained the cosmic order that kept Egypt stable and the Nile flooding on schedule. They had reached for perfection, and for a brief moment under the Fourth Dynasty sun they held it. But perfection is expensive, and the question that would haunt every generation after was whether it could be sustained, or whether the age of giants was already ending. By the time Khufu's grandson Menkaure finished his own, more modest pyramid at Giza, the age of giant experiments was basically over. Later kings would build pyramids, but none would match the Fourth Dynasty for scale or ambition. The perfect form had been achieved. The question now was what to do with it. And if you leave the royal cemeteries around Memphis and head south along the Nile, another question appears. One that feels smaller at first, then grows stranger the more you think about it. Scattered along hundreds of kilometers of riverbank, tucked near provincial towns, far from any royal necropolis, stand a series of little step pyramids. Not one vast monument dominating the horizon, but at least 7 tiny rough masonry cousins. At Sayla in the Fayum region, at Zawiyat el-Mayitin near modern Minya, at Nakada, El Kula, Sinki, Edfu South, and on the island of Elephantine near Egypt's southern border, each one only about 10 to 20 meters high when complete. Just a handful of steps, no vast internal corridors, no granite-lined burial chamber, no sarcophagus. They're solid. To an engineer, that's the strangest fact. These things are basically big stone piles with a stepped profile. No hidden rooms, no tunnels, just layers of local stone rising in small, crude terraces, like an echo of Djoser's masterpiece shrunk down and hollowed of purpose. Archaeologists usually date them to the late 3rd Dynasty or early 4th, roughly the time of Huni and Sneferu, when the court around Memphis was still experimenting with large-scale stone construction, many scholars tentatively credit Huni with commissioning the whole series, though the masonry and context are slippery enough that some suggest later kings joined in, adding one here or there. If they're not tombs, what are they? One idea is that they are cenotaphs, empty tombs for the king's car, his vital essence scattered along the length of his realm. In this view, the real body rests safely in a great royal pyramid near the capital, but symbolic tombs in the provinces allow the king's spiritual presence to be rooted everywhere. Wherever you look, there he is, stepped stone climbing toward the sky. Another school of thought sees them as political statements, markers of royal authority placed in key administrative centres after the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The message would be simple and visible from far away. This town, this stretch of farmland, this bend of the Nile, it all belongs to the throne. Some researchers lean toward a religious function. Perhaps they were local cult places dedicated to Horus, the falcon god with whom the living king was identified, or to the rising sun that would later dominate royal theology. A stepped pyramid, even a tiny one, is still an artificial mountain, still a place where sky and earth symbolically meet, where offerings can rise and blessings descend. Others imagine them as boundary markers on a grand scale, a chain of little stone beacons mapping the skeleton of the unified kingdom. But when you look closely at their distribution, the pattern isn't neat enough to be obvious waypoints or border stones. Some stand near old settlement mounds, others near quarries or crossings. The logic is there, but it's not transparent. Excavations haven't helped as much as you might hope. There are almost no inscriptions on the structures themselves, no carved dedicatory texts explaining their purpose. No surviving temple complexes wrapped around them, just stair-stepped shells of stone, eroded by thousands of years of wind and sand, with a few scattered potsherds and traces of offering activity nearby. We are left with possibilities, not certainty. What they do show us, quietly but firmly, is that even at the very moment Egypt was inventing the giant royal tomb pyramid, the same architectural language was being spoken in a different dialect out in the provinces. The pyramid idea was already more flexible than the gleaming colossus at Giza might make us think. It could be a monumental royal grave, but it could also be a compact, solid, probably cultic structure with no body inside at all. Then history moved on. The Old Kingdom collapsed around 2200 BCE in a tangle of Niles, famine, regional power grabs, and administrative breakdown. The Great Pyramid fields went quiet. When central authority revived in the Middle Kingdom, almost 5 centuries later, the kings of the 12th dynasty did something revealing. They brought the pyramid back. Amenemhat I, Senusret I, Amenemhat II, and especially Amenemhat III all built pyramids. But if you visit their remains today, most of what you see is rubble, not because they were small or because the builders were incompetent, but because the construction strategy had changed. Instead of solid cores of massive limestone like Sneferu's Red Pyramid, Middle Kingdom architects often used mud brick for the main body, with a relatively thin veneer of fine limestone casing on the outside. It was cheaper, faster, and logistically easier. But when that casing was stripped in later ages for building stone, the vulnerable inner structure was left exposed. Thousands of years of weather have turned once impressive pyramids into low, slumping mounds, barely recognizable without excavation. Above ground, the shape persisted. Below ground and around the base, something new was happening. The substructures and mortuary temples of these Middle Kingdom pyramids became far more elaborate. Labyrinthine passageways, multiple chambers, tricky angles, hidden niches. One complex associated with Amenemhat III at Hawara impressed later Greek visitors so much that they called it simply the Labyrinth, a bewildering maze of rooms and corridors. It's as if the pyramid had split into two expressions, the outer form simplified and economized, the inner experience underground and architectural, growing ever more complex, a puzzle for robbers to solve, a journey for the king's soul to travel, a ritual map of the afterlife. And still, thieves came. Tomb robbery was not a late development in Egypt. It was a constant background pressure. From early on, the promise of concentrated wealth, gold, precious stones, fine linens, ritual equipment, inside a known burial monument was irresistible. Old Kingdom pyramids were broken into in antiquity. Middle Kingdom pyramids were no safer. The very visibility that made these monuments powerful statements of kingship also made them excellent targets. In the New Kingdom, the royal response was radical. Kings stopped putting their bodies inside pyramids at all. Instead, pharaohs of the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties carved their tombs deep into the limestone cliffs west of Thebes, in the valley we now call the Valley of the Kings. From the floodplain, you can't see the tombs themselves, just a desolate wadi walled in rock. The monumental architecture, the place where ritual and propaganda still played out, shifted to separate mortuary temples on the edge of the cultivation, like Hatshepsut's terraced temple at Deir el-Bahri, or Ramesses III's complex at Medinet Habu. The tomb became hidden, secret, ideally known only to a small circle of trusted workers and priests. Its decoration focused on the king's journey through the night, through the underworld, guided by the sun god in his bark. Labyrinths of corridors now tunneled through rock instead of mud brick cores, and yet, even here, pyramid symbolism never entirely vanished. If you stand in the Valley of the Kings and look up, one peak dominates the skyline, a sharp, conical mountain called El Qurn. Its profile is uncannily pyramidal, rising above the clustered tomb entrances like a natural stone pyramid placed by geology instead of kings. Many Egyptologists think this was not an accident of taste. By placing their hidden tombs under a mountain that already looked like a pyramid, New Kingdom rulers could tap into the old symbolism without advertising the exact location of their graves. Meanwhile, among the people who actually dug those tombs, the pyramid quietly came back in miniature. At Deir el-Medina, the village of royal craftsmen and artisans who carved and painted the pharaoh's sepulchres, private tombs often had small brick pyramids built above their chapels, a narrow, steep little pyramid, sometimes topped with a stone pyramidion painted with solar or funerary motifs, sat over a modest cult space. The actual burial lay down a shaft nearby or beneath. These structures were tiny, often no more than a few meters on a side, but their form was unmistakable. Ordinary scribes, foremen and painters were claiming in reduced scale the same shape that had once been the exclusive privilege of god-kings. The pyramid had become a personal memorial, a focus for family offerings, a way to mark a life and ask for a good place in the next world. From Huni's mysterious little step pyramids in the provinces, to the giant royal tombs at Giza, to eroded Middle Kingdom mounds fronting maze-like temples, to invisible New Kingdom burials tucked under a natural pyramid-shaped peak, to workers' brick mini-pyramids standing over simple shafts, the form kept changing roles. It never quite meant the same thing twice. Even within a single civilization, over the course of 2,000 years, the pyramid was a moving target. Tomb and symbol, beacon and boundary, royal prerogative and private hope. Sometimes solid and empty, sometimes hollow and packed with treasure, sometimes reduced to a brief outline against the sky. And as the Nile carried these shapes past fields and villages, another river of ideas was flowing south, beyond Egypt's first cataract, into a different kingdom that would one day pick up the pyramid form and make it their own, sharper, steeper, and multiplied by the hundreds. South of the first cataract, the river narrows and the cliffs close in. Granite boulders break the current. The Nile stops being a languid highway and becomes something rougher, more layered. This region the Egyptians called Tarseti, the land of the bow. Further on, the land that Greek writers would later call Ethiopia. Today, northern Sudan. For most of pharaonic history, Egyptian scribes wrote about the people here as neighbours, rivals, trading partners, sometimes enemies. They came for gold, for incense, for exotic animals, for prisoners of war. They carved victory scenes on temple walls showing Nubian chiefs in foreign clothes, brought to their knees before the king of the two lands. But history has a habit of turning pictures around. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, Egypt's own power was fading. The new kingdom fractured, foreign dynasties came and went, and the glitter of the old court at Memphis and Thebes grew dim. South of the cataracts, in the lands that had once been Egyptian provinces, a new centre of gravity formed. We call it the Kingdom of Kush. At first its capital clustered near a sacred sandstone outcrop called Jebel Barkal, a flat-topped mountain that rises abruptly from the desert plain. The Egyptians had already marked this place out as special, building temples there and identifying it as a kind of southern counterpart to their own holy sites. Kushite rulers took that symbolism and made it their own. Around Napata, in the shadow of Jebel Barkal, a local dynasty grew rich on trade, iron and control of the Nile. Then, in a twist that would have startled those old Egyptian painters, the kings of Kush marched north and took Egypt. Around 747 BCE, a Kushite ruler named Piye led an army into the Nile Valley, and over the next decades his successors established what we now call the 25th dynasty. For almost a century, kings with Nubian names and Kushite ancestry sat on the Egyptian throne, performed Egyptian rituals, restored crumbling Egyptian temples, and wrote about themselves in impeccable Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were foreign, but they were also deeply fluent in the culture they had inherited, and when the time came to bury their dead, they reached for a shape that had, by then, been mostly dormant in Egypt for a very long time. The pyramid, not the flat-topped mastaba, not the hidden cliff tomb. The old, unmistakable profile, a triangular slope narrowing to a point against the sky. But here, south of Egypt, something new happened. The earliest Kushite royal burials at sites like El Kuru and latest Nuri show a transition, from older, mound-like tumuli to small, steep pyramids rising over underground chambers. By the time the royal cemetery shifted fully to Meroe, further downstream, the Kushite pyramid had found its mature form. If you walk among them in your mind, the scale feels strange at first. Forget the Great Pyramid's sweeping baselines and slow, shallow angles. Nubian pyramids are much smaller in footprint, often just a few meters wide at the base, rising sharply to heights of 10, 20, maybe 30 meters at most. Many stand at slopes of around 60 or 70 degrees like stone spears driven into the desert. There are a lot of them. Across the royal fields at Napata and especially at Meroe, archaeologists count more than 200 Nubian pyramids, more in total than in all of Egypt. At Meroe alone, 3 main cemeteries, north, south, and west of the ancient city, hold well over 100 steep, narrow monuments crowded together on low ridges of sand. Seen from a distance, they look like a jagged forest of triangles, each one casting a thin shadow. Up close, another difference appears. These are not massive, solid limestone mountains like Sneferu's great projects. Most Kushite pyramids have cores of roughly laid stone rubble or brick, faced in sandstone blocks, their outer surfaces once plastered smooth and likely painted. Time and erosion have chewed away much of that outer skin, but enough remains to show careful masonry, not just piled rock, and they are not empty symbols. Each Nubian pyramid, or at least each royal and elite one, is paired with a small chapel attached to its eastern face. The chapel is often a simple rectangular room opening toward the rising sun, with a doorway framed by carved sandstone. Step inside in imagination and the walls come alive. Relief panels show the dead king or queen standing before gods who would be instantly familiar to an Egyptian priest of the New Kingdom. Osiris, lord of the underworld, Isis, the mourner and magician, Anubis with his jackal head, falcon-formed Horus, the sun disk with its encircling cobra. There are offering tables piled with bread and fowl, jars of beer and wine, lines of priests and attendants bringing gifts. But look more closely. The royal figures wear Kushite crowns, heavy earrings, distinctive jewellery. Their names, carved in cartouches, are those of Kushite rulers. In some chapels alongside Egyptian hieroglyphs appear signs of a different script entirely. The cursive strokes of Meroitic writing, the indigenous language of the kingdom. Local deities slip into the pantheon, regional titles into the text. What you are seeing is not simple imitation, it's translation. Kushite elites took the Egyptian idea of the pyramid tomb complex, the external marker above, the burial chamber below, the ritual chapel for ongoing offerings in between, and rebuilt it in their own landscape, their own materials, their own style. They accepted the broad logic, a monument that ties the dead to the sky, a place for the living to feed the memory of the king, images of an afterlife structured by gods and judgment. But they changed the accent. The steepness of the pyramids, the clustering of dozens of monuments on relatively small burial hills, the specific mix of Egyptian and local religious imagery, these choices turn the form into something distinctively Kushite. Over roughly 1,000 years from about the 8th century BCE into the 4th century CE, while Egypt's own royal pyramid tradition remained a distant memory, the people of Kush kept building them. The style did not stand still. Early Napatan monuments tend to be simpler, with stronger echoes of Egyptian prototypes. As time goes on, chapels at Meroe become more elaborate. Reliefs grow more crowded, compositions more inventive. Inscriptions shift gradually from purely Egyptian hieroglyphs toward Meroitic script, signalling not just a change in artistic fashion, but in written language and identity. The underground tombs themselves evolve, multiple chambers, different arrangements of sarcophagi and grave goods, varying blends of Egyptian, Nubian, and later influences. From El Kuru to Nuri to Meroe, you can trace a line of experimentation. A borrowed architectural idea is not frozen. It breathes, adapts, sprouts local branches. The pyramid, carried south centuries earlier as the prestige form of a northern empire, becomes the emblem of another kingdom's own religious and political life. And then, long after the last Kushite king was laid to rest under a steep sandstone cone, the monuments faced a new kind of danger. In the 1830s, an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Fellini arrived at Meroe with a simple assumption. If the Egyptian pyramids had once housed gold and royal jewellery, surely these southern pyramids did too. Lacking patience for careful excavation, he chose a more direct method. He blew the tops off. Using explosives, Fellini and his workers hacked into pyramid after pyramid, cutting off their pointed crowns, digging down from above in search of hidden chambers and hoards. In at least one case he found spectacular treasure, a queen's jewellery so intricate and refined that European collectors initially refused to believe it came from Black Africa at all. Only when they saw the objects did they relent. The treasures sold, the damage remained. Even today, many of the pyramids at Meroe stand truncated, their summits jagged or simply gone, as if some invisible hand had lopped them off. It is a quiet, enduring record of 19th century looting, of a time when Kushite history was treated not as a civilization's memory, but as a quarry for curiosities. So the story of these pyramids is double. On one side, they represent one of the clearest cases we have of cultural transmission. A society sees a prestigious monument in a powerful neighbour, adopts it consciously, and then reshapes it over centuries into something linked but new. No need to invoke lost continents or forgotten world-spanning builders here. The line of influence is visible, written in stone and inscription. On the other side, they remind us that adoption is never just copying. The choice to keep building pyramids in Kush, long after Egypt had moved on to different royal tomb forms, says something about how powerful that shape had become for them. A steep compact pyramid, a chapel for offerings, an underground chamber filled with objects meant to work in the next world. This was how a Kushite king or queen should be remembered. The angle is sharper, the scale is smaller, the number is greater, the meaning overlaps with Egypt's but is not identical. A mountain for the dead can wear more than one cultural face. As the wind shifts the sand around these broken points of stone, another question begins to surface. If a pyramid can travel from one culture to another and change so much along the way, what happens when we look even farther afield, beyond the Nile altogether, to places where no Egyptian architect ever set foot, but where the same basic shape rises anyway, for different gods, under different skies? To follow that question, we have to leave the Nile altogether, not just cross a border, but change rivers. Imagine turning your back on the Saharan sky and walking east, over deserts and dry plateaus, until another waterway appears. Not a single, narrow strip like the Nile, but a broad lowland where two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, wander and split and rejoin, looping through mudflats and reeds. This is Mesopotamia, in Greek simply the land between the rivers. Today, mostly Iraq, with parts of Syria and Iran. Here too humans learned to stack earth toward the sky. Long before anyone carved limestone blocks for Khufu or raised sandstone for Kushite queens, people in this alluvial plain were already lifting their sacred places above the flood. The ground here is flat, the horizon huge. There is no natural stone to quarry in the riverine heartland, only clay, endlessly replenished, endlessly malleable. So they baked it. From the Ubaid period onward, small raised platforms of mud brick supported early shrines. Over centuries those platforms grew. As villages swelled into cities like Uruk, Ur and Babylon, the low podiums under their temples thickened and tiered, lifting the holy rooms higher and higher above the surrounding streets. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, the shape had become something unmistakable, the ziggurat. The word comes to us through Akkadian, probably from a root meaning to build high, to raise. In its mature form, a ziggurat is a massive terraced tower, a solid mountain of sun-dried bricks, reinforced with layers of reeds and rubble, its outer skin faced with harder fired bricks, sometimes glazed in shining colours. Each level steps back from the one below, creating a series of receding platforms stacked toward the sky. From a distance it looks like a staircase that has forgotten what it was supposed to be attached to and simply climbs into emptiness. One of the clearest examples we have is at a city with a name that already feels familiar from other stories. Ur. Sometime around 2100 BCE, a king named Ur-Nammu decided to remake his capital's Sacred Heart. Ruler of what we call the Third Dynasty of Ur, he commissioned a new temple complex for the city's patron deity, the moon god Nana, Sin, as later Babylonians would call him. At the center of that complex he ordered a ziggurat. Try to picture it as it would have looked when the bricks were fresh. A broad rectangular base, its core a dense lattice of mud bricks, each stamped with Ur-Nammu's name. On top of that, a second, smaller terrace. Above that, a third. 3 great stepped stories in all, each receding like layers of a wedding cake, but made of sun-baked clay. At the front, 3 monumental staircases rise from ground level, one in the centre, 2 flanking it at angles, converging on the first terrace. From there, a single grand stair continues upward, leading not into the mass of the tower, but onto its back, toward a small rectangular building that once stood on the summit. Not a burial chamber, a temple. In Egyptian pyramids, the focus of ritual is hidden deep inside. Narrow passages, sealed sarcophagi, the king's body laid away from human eyes. At Ur, the holier space was out in the open air, visible from below as a shining shrine on the ziggurat's crown. This was understood as the dwelling place of Nana in his city, a house for the god to inhabit, furnished, supplied, tended by priests. The whole tower is a kind of cosmic front porch. The god does not descend into a hidden grave. The god descends symbolically to this elevated room. The stairs are not there for a dead king to climb in some imagined afterlife, but for living humans, priests, perhaps royal figures on special occasions, to ascend and perform offerings, pour libations, recite prayers. Ordinary people would have remained in the courtyards below, watching smoke drift up from a height they would never personally reach. Same broad silhouette as a step pyramid, tiered, geometric, monumental, very different logic. This contrast runs deep. Egyptian royal pyramids, at least in their classic Old Kingdom form, are tombs first and foremost. They are made of stone, the hardest, most enduring material available, and once the burial is complete, they are meant to be closed, even if a cult continues in chapels nearby. Mesopotamian ziggurats, by contrast, are temples raised on platforms. They are house mountains for gods, not graves for kings. They are made of clay, not quarried stone. Millions upon millions of sun-dried bricks, vulnerable to rain and time. They require constant maintenance. Kings boast in inscriptions of repairing or rebuilding older ziggurats, peeling away their eroded faces, refacing them, sometimes adding new tiers or new decorative glazed bricks. Pyramids in Egypt are finished and sealed, ziggurats are perpetual projects, and yet in both cases the form reaches upward, towards something beyond the human scale. Many modern scholars talk about the ziggurat as an axis mundi, a world axis, a place where earth and sky touch. That sounds abstract, but in Mesopotamian texts the idea often appears in concrete form. The great ziggurat of Babylon, whose Sumerian ceremonial name was Etemenanki, was called House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. A foundation is what holds two things together. You can imagine how this would feel if you lived in one of these cities. On ordinary streets, mud brick houses crowd together, 1 or 2 stories high, their flat roofs at the same level. Then you turn a corner, and there it is. A human-made mountain, squared and stepped, each terrace planted perhaps with trees or shrubs in some periods, its summit crowned with a brightly painted shrine. It dwarfs the palace. It anchors the skyline. It says wordlessly, "This is where the god lives. This is where our city meets the sky." The similarity to pyramids elsewhere is not just geometric. In Egypt, the king's tomb mountain ties him to the sun, to the circumpolar stars, to the heavens where he is supposed to rule forever. In Mesopotamia, the temple tower ties the city to its patron deity, and by extension to the cosmic order that deity maintains. Different religions, different stories, same intuition. If you want to be closer to the gods, you build up. It is tempting to imagine a line of influence between these great traditions. After all, Egypt and Mesopotamia were not sealed bubbles. Trade routes, diplomatic letters, even occasional wars link the Nile and the Euphrates. Perhaps someone saw a distant pyramid or a distant ziggurat and brought back the idea. But the evidence we have does not demand that explanation. Early Egyptian pyramids can be traced quite cleanly from local mastaba tombs, rectangular benches that simply grew taller and more complex until they stacked into something stepped. Mesopotamian ziggurats grow just as naturally out of earlier low temple platforms that were raised gradually higher to protect shrines from floods and to mark them out from the houses around them. Two river civilizations with different climates, different building materials, different theologies, both discover that piling earth toward the sky in neat receding tiers is an effective way to manifest sacredness in public space. Convergent solutions born from similar questions. The ziggurat tradition was not limited to one kingdom either. Sumerian city-states, later Akkadian and Babylonian monarchs, Assyrian rulers further north, and Elamite dynasties in what is now southwestern Iran, all built their own versions. Some had only 2 or 3 terraces. Others, like Etemenanki at Babylon in its later form, may have reached 7 levels. We do not know exactly how high that great tower rose. Only its foundations survive, and ancient descriptions vary, but they agree on one thing: it dominated the city. Centuries after many of these structures had crumbled, another story was told about a tower in this land between rivers. In the book of Genesis, there is a tale of humans deciding to make a name for themselves by building a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. In the story, the project goes wrong. The deity scatters the builders and confuses their languages, and the place gains a new name: Babel. Most modern scholars see in that story an echo of ziggurats, perhaps especially of Babylon's Etemenanki. To later visitors from the West, the idea of a giant artificial mountain reaching toward the sky, built by people who all spoke the same tongue, it must have lingered in the imagination. By the time that memory was set down in Hebrew, the bricks of many original towers had already been reused, their shapes softened back into the mud from which they'd come. But the image of a stepped ascent, a stairway for gods and for hubristic humans, remained. So now our picture of the world's pyramids has gained another family. In Egypt and Kush, stone or sandstone cones for the dead. On the Tigris and Euphrates, mud brick mountains for living gods. Independent traditions, born from local needs and landscapes, converging on a similar grammar of height and geometry. If ziggurats were cosmic foundations where heaven and earth touched, what happens when we keep travelling still farther west, across an entire ocean, and find yet more stepped mountains rising from different valleys, under different stars, with no way at all to borrow from Ur or Giza? When you follow that last question, the map in your mind has to stretch again, past the Levant, past the Mediterranean, past any coastline that people of Ur or Memphis ever imagined, over an expanse of water so wide that for most of human history it might as well have been another sky. Across the Atlantic. On the far side, another set of rivers, another chain of mountains, different constellations wheeling overhead, a world where maize, not wheat, becomes the grain of life, where jaguars and quetzal birds, not lions or ibises, stalk the sacred stories, and here too people start piling earth into mountains. The really striking part is that there is no credible evidence of contact between Egypt or Mesopotamia and these lands in the deep past. No ancient Phoenician fleets, no lost Atlanteans bringing blueprints. Just separate populations descended from the same remote ancestors, reinventing monumental geometry on their own. One of the earliest places we see it in this hemisphere is an island of higher ground in a swampy coastal plain in what is now southern Mexico, La Venta. Around the first millennium before our era, people we call the Olmec turned this low rise into the heart of a ceremonial centre. They shaped plazas, buried mosaics of greenstone, raised colossal heads that still gaze sleepily out of the soil, and they built a pyramid. If you could peel back the jungle and the centuries of erosion, the Great Pyramid of La Venta would come into focus as a huge earthen mound, about 34 meters high, roughly 110 feet. Rectangular in plan, originally stepped, it contains something like 100,000 cubic meters of fill. It is not stone-faced, not sharp-edged in the way we tend to picture pyramids. It is more like an artificial hill, compressed out of basket loads of earth, layered and compacted until it towers above the marshes. We do not have a clear written record for what the Olmec called it, or exactly what rituals played out on its summit. That knowledge went into the ground with them. But from the layout of the site, processional ways, offerings placed along axes, alignments that seem to track the movement of the sun, it is hard to escape a familiar impression. This too was a man-made mountain, a place where earth reached up toward the sky, and where whatever beings the Olmec revered were invited to meet them halfway. From La Venta onward, the shape spreads, successor cultures in central and southern Mexico, and into what is now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, inherit and transform the idea of the raised platform. Over more than 1,000 years, modest mounds swell into vast complexes. Some stay low and broad, others pile steeply, narrowing as they climb, carrying small temples on their summits like crowns. By the turn of the first millennium of our era, one particular city in the central highlands of Mexico has taken this practice to a new scale, Teotihuacan. When the first people settled this valley, the great volcanoes that hem it in were already old. To the south, Popocatépetl rose snow-capped. To the east, Cerro Gordo loomed like a sleeping guardian. Between them, on a broad, gently sloping plain, Teotihuacan grew into something astonishing. At its height, between about 100 BCE and 550 CE, it may have held 100,000 people or more. Its streets were laid out in a grid, its neighborhoods organized, its drainage channeled. This was not a city that just happened. It was planned. The heart of that plan is a broad processional avenue running roughly north-south, the Avenue of the Dead. Along its length, plazas open like lungs. On either side, stepped platforms and multi-story apartment compounds rise in careful rows, and dominating the whole northern half of the city are two pyramids that seem to bring the surrounding mountains into human scale. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. Today, the Pyramid of the Sun stands about 65 meters high, around 200 feet, with a base roughly 220 meters on each side. It is one of the largest single structures ever built in the ancient Americas, a mass of stone and rubble fill encased in carefully cut talud tablero facades, sloping panels topped by vertical rectangles, repeating like a pattern of breaths as the building climbs. To its north, anchoring the end of the Avenue of the Dead, the Pyramid of the Moon rises on a slightly smaller scale, echoing the shape of Cerro Gordo behind it so closely that the hill and the monument almost rhyme. We can measure these things. We can map their angles. Note that the city's grid is skewed slightly from true north, perhaps to align with particular celestial events or the setting of the Pleiades. We can excavate offerings buried at key points in their construction. Obsidian blades, jade, shell, sacrificed animals, and, in some cases, human remains. What we cannot do, at least not yet, is read the builder's own explanation. Teotihuacan left murals filled with symbols, and there are a few borrowed glyphs from later scripts, but nothing like the self-narrating inscriptions carved on an Egyptian pyramid's chapel or a Babylonian king's foundation brick. The language spoken here, the names the inhabitants use for their temples and gods, their myths of how the world began, those are still debated, teased out of art and later Maya and Aztec stories that look back at this city as already ancient. So the Avenue of the Dead remains in some sense an avenue of questions. We see that these pyramids were not isolated tombs hidden in the desert. They fronted onto plazas that could hold thousands, even tens of thousands of people. Their staircases are broad, their summit platforms open, a stage more than a sealed chamber. Whatever happened on those heights, it was meant to be watched. Teotihuacan was not alone in this. To the south, in the hills of Oaxaca, another city had done something equally radical with the landscape: Monte Alban. Here, the Zapotec chose not a valley floor but a ridge. They spent generations cutting and filling, literally levelling the top of a mountain to create a great rectangular plaza, 300 meters long, ringed by stepped platforms, temples and palaces. From the plain below, Monte Alban must have seemed like a floating island of stone. On its surface, platform pyramids serve as bases for shrines and council halls, stairways rising from the plaza to the buildings above. Inscriptions carved on slabs hint at wars, alliances, lineages. But again, the pattern is clear. The most important structures are up, on tiers, reached by stairs, focused around open spaces where crowds could assemble. The pyramid is not an isolated monument here. It is one unit in a larger conversation between earth, sky, and community. Farther east and south, that conversation takes on still more elaborate forms among the Maya. If Teotihuacan's pyramids feel like massive, somewhat impersonal mountains, many Maya examples feel intricate, almost baroque. At cities like Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul and Copain, steep limestone staircases run like spines up tall, narrow pyramidal mounds, leading to roof-combed temples whose upper tiers slice dramatically into the sky. Consider Tikal Temple 1 in what is now Guatemala. Built in the 8th century CE, it rises about 47 meters above the plaza. Its stairway climbs so sharply that from the ground, the steps seem to merge into a single plane. At the top, a small temple room opens onto the void, and above even that a masonry comb frames the horizon. It is not just a lookout point, not just a shrine. Deep within its core, archaeologists discover the burial of a king, Jasor Chan Kawil I, laid to rest with jade ornaments, jaguar pelts, and offerings. The whole towering structure is in a sense his tombstone, but it is also a functioning temple, a place where priests continued to perform rituals long after his burial. At Palenque in Chiapas, the Temple of the Inscriptions makes this duality explicit. From the outside, it is a stepped pyramid about 27 meters high, supporting a temple whose walls are covered with long, hieroglyphic texts. For years, that was all anyone knew. Then, in 1952, excavations revealed a sealed stairway descending from the temple floor down into the heart of the pyramid. At the bottom, in a chamber deep inside the artificial mountain, lay a massive stone sarcophagus. Inside it, the remains of Pakal, Palenque's great ruler, his face covered with a mosaic jade mask, his body adorned with intricately carved jewelry. Above, the temple continued to function, its inscriptions recounting dynastic history and ritual obligations. Below, the dead king slept within the pyramid. In Egypt, the king's pyramid and the place of his funerary cult are connected but distinct. Tomb here, mortuary temple there. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat is the god's house altogether, not a grave. Among the Maya, the two functions often fuse: pyramid as temple, pyramid as tomb, pyramid as a vertical axis connecting the underworld, the human world and the sky. The way these buildings came into being also differs in a telling way. If you imagine a pyramid as a single grand project, a pharaoh orders it, thousands labour for decades, it is completed, sealed, and left to stand. That image fits fairly well for the great stone monuments on the Nile. In Mesoamerica, the story is more layered. Again and again, archaeologists have found that the impressive pyramid you see today is not the first version of itself. Beneath later facades, earlier, smaller structures hide like dolls inside dolls. At Teotihuacan, cores of older temples lurk within the great pyramids. At Maya sites, tunneling into staircases reveals previous staircases, completely buried, still bearing stucco masks or paintings that no one was meant to see again. This practice of superimposition, building a new, larger pyramid over an older one, could happen multiple times at a single spot. Each enlargement seems to mark something: the accession of a new ruler, the completion of a calendrical cycle, a major victory or dedication. A pyramid in this logic is less a finished object than a growing organism. It thickens with time, each generation wrapping its own layer of stone around the bones left by the last. The sky itself became a partner in these designs. One of the most famous examples stands at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, the pyramid of Kukulkan, often called El Castillo. On ordinary days, it is a well-proportioned stepped pyramid roughly 24 to 30 meters high, with 4 staircases, each with 91 steps. Add the top platform as a final step, and the total comes to 365, a neat echo of the solar year. Around the equinoxes, something else happens. In the late afternoon, as the sun angles low, the northwest edge of the pyramid casts a series of sharp, triangular shadows onto the balustrade of the main staircase. For about 3/4 of an hour, those triangles link up with a large stone serpent head carved at the base, creating the illusion of a great feathered serpent undulating down the side of the monument. Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl in central Mexican tradition, the feathered serpent deity, seems to visit his own temple in light and shadow. Most researchers agree this effect is intentional. It requires not only careful astronomical observation, but also a precise understanding of how the sun's path will interact with the pyramid's angles at a specific time of year. Here again, architecture is doing more than providing a platform. It is telling time. It is enacting a myth with geometry and sunlight. Through all these variations, one thread runs consistently in the Americas. These pyramids are not primarily quiet tombs, sealed and left alone. They are stages in the most literal sense, platforms for ceremonies that recur again and again, offerings of incense and food, dances, recitations, the burning of copal, the playing of ritual ball games in adjacent courts. In some cases, they are also theatres of blood. At certain periods and in certain regions, human sacrifice formed part of the ritual economy of these places. People offered to gods on the heights of temples, their deaths believed to sustain maize, rain, the turning of the calendar. The details vary and are still being refined by scholarship, and popular images of constant carnage are almost certainly exaggerated. But the core point is sober. These were living, working, sacred machines at the heart of cities, not dead monuments on the margins. Day after day, smoke and sound would have risen from their summits. Processions would have climbed and descended their stairs. New plaster would have been applied, new paint laid down, new dedicatory caches buried in their cores. If Egyptian pyramids embody a single, monumental bet on one king's eternity, many Mesoamerican pyramids feel more like the pulse of a community, thickening, renewing, synchronizing human lives with celestial cycles. So now our map has grown again. On one side of the ocean, stone cones on the Nile, mud brick terraces on the Tigris and Euphrates. On the other, earthen hills at La Venta, vast stepped mounds at Teotihuacan and Monte Alban, steep temple tombs in the Maya lowlands, serpent-shadowed pyramids at Chichen Itza. No shared engineers, no shared scriptures, just different peoples, in different ecosystems, independently deciding that the right way to anchor their worlds is to raise a geometric mountain in the middle of their cities. And they were not alone on this continent either. If we turn our attention south along the Andes, or north into the river valleys of what is now the United States, we find yet more artificial hills and platforms, some pyramidal, some sprawling, all part of the same quiet global conversation between gravity, belief, and the human urge to build up. Far to the south, along a spine of mountains that would one day be called the Andes, another tradition of raising the earth was already underway. If you could strip away the modern towns and fields and look back 5,000 years, the desert coast of what is now Peru would not seem like the obvious place for cities. Narrow river valleys cut green fingers through a landscape of sand and stone. Between them, dryness, silence, the Pacific breathing in and out. Along one of those rivers, the Supa, people began to stack the land. Carol soup. Between about 3000 and 1800 BCE, long before the Inca, before the Mochi, before pottery was even common in the region, communities along this valley built something extraordinary, an urban centre of plazas, temples, and great platform mounds. The platforms are not smooth white cones like Giza. They are stepped masses of stone and earth, faced with rough walls, edged with staircases. In front of them, sunken circular plazas drop into the ground like inverted cups, open to the sky. From above, the site reads almost like a diagram. Circular voids, rectangular platforms, lines of stairs drawing you from one level to another. The whole thing is geometry imposed on a desert terrace. We do not know what language the builders spoke. We do not have their myths written out, but we can see their priorities. They gathered labour from scattered farming and fishing communities and poured it into these mounds and plazas. They created a place where people could converge, descend into round courtyards, then climb stepped platforms and stand elevated above the valley floor. It is tempting to think in terms of firsts. The earliest city in the Americas, one of the oldest pyramidal complexes. Archaeology is cautious about that kind of ranking, but there is broad agreement that Carol Supe belongs among the earliest monumental landscapes in the New World. Long before anyone in this region was carving royal biographies in stone, they were already reshaping Earth to create artificial heights and depths, places where human ceremony could unfold between sky and ground. Over the next couple of millennia, farther north along the Peruvian coast, the basic vocabulary of the platform mound becomes more massive, more intricate, and more explicitly tied to political power. Cultures rise and fall in waves, among them the Moche. On a wide dry plain near the Moche River, sometime between about 100 and 800 CE, two great adobe huacas dominated the horizon, Huaca del Sol, the Pyramid of the Sun, and Huaca de la Luna, the Pyramid of the Moon. Today, erosion and the river's shifting course have taken their toll, especially on Huaca del Sol, but even in its damaged state you can still sense its scale. Archaeologists estimate that in its prime it rose in 4 broad tiers to perhaps 50 metres, with a base over 300 metres long and more than 150 wide. A staggered stepped mountain made not of stone blocks, but of sun-dried bricks. Those bricks carry faint repeating marks, signs impressed before firing, different for different batches. When researchers counted them, they realized there were not just a few symbols, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, representing different communities or work groups. Labour, in other words, was mobilized across a whole region. Each group brought its quota of bricks, leaving its name stamped into the body of the pyramid. What rose from that collective effort was not a simple tomb. The Huaca seems to have served as the core of a capital, the focus of ceremonies that blended warfare, sacrifice and fertility. Its summit probably supported elite residences and ritual spaces. Like the platforms in Mesoamerica, these Andean mounds are stages and seats of authority more than sealed stone coffins. Power in adobe, layered and relayered. Even under the later Inca, who built more with finely fitted stone than with mud brick, the impulse remained. Across the highlands and valleys they raised flat-topped ceremonial platforms, ushnus, on which rulers sat. Libations were poured, and offerings were made to the sun and the earth. Some were modest terraces in village plazas, Others were multi-tiered constructions standing at the center of imperial administrative complexes. The shape is simpler than a towering pyramid, but the logic is the same. Create an elevated, bounded space where human and sacred business can take place above the level of the everyday. If we swing our map north now over jungle and plain, past Mesoamerica, and into the wide river systems of what is now the United States, the story of raised earth changes material again, but not pattern. In the floodplains of the Mississippi and its tributaries, people have been building mounds for thousands of years, conical burial mounds, serpentine effigies, low platforms. By around 1050 CE, in the bottomlands across the river from where St. Louis stands today, those scattered traditions coalesced into something that looked, in its own way, like a city. Cahokia. At its height, between roughly 1050 and 1350, Cahokia spread over several square miles. Estimates suggest perhaps 10 to 20,000 residents in and around the central precinct, making it the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica in its time. Its layout is anchored around a gigantic earthen platform. Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound does not glitter. From a distance, it can almost pass for a natural hill softened by grass. But it is entirely artificial, about 30 meters high, shaped into 4 broad terraces, with a base nearly 300 meters long on one side and a little less on the other. In terms of footprint, it rivals the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its core is baskets of dirt, layer upon layer of carefully arranged soils and clays, shaped and reshaped over generations. On its summit, evidence of post holes and burned layers suggest there once stood a large timber building, perhaps a great temple, perhaps the residence of a paramount chief whose authority radiated out across the surrounding countryside. Around it, more than 100 other mounds of varying shapes rose, some platform, some conical, some ridged. Plazas opened between them. Wooden circles, sometimes called wood henges, mark the solstices and equinoxes. As at Cahokia's southern and Andean cousins, we do not have a native written account of what any of this meant. European chroniclers, arriving centuries too late and with their own agendas, tended to dismiss such earthworks as the traces of some vanished, more advanced race, or to downplay them altogether. For a long time, the idea that indigenous peoples of North America could have planned and built a city on this scale was simply not entertained in many textbooks. Yet the dirt itself disagrees. Stratigraphy shows repeated building phases, quarry scars trace where soil was dug. The mound's alignments and the arrangement of plazas suggest conscious design. A community that can coordinate the movement of millions of basket loads of earth is not an accident. It is a society capable of planning, leadership, and shared belief strong enough to keep people hauling soil to a central hill for decades. From Peru's adobe giants to Illinois' earth platforms, the materials differ, but the gesture repeats. Take low ground and make it high. Turn a flat floodplain or desert terrace into a topography of meaning. And it is not just the Americas. If we let our attention drift farther west, across the Pacific, other examples flicker up on the edge of night. In northern China, beneath fields and forests, lie huge imperial tumuli. The most famous belongs to the first emperor of Qian, the ruler buried with an army of life-size terracotta soldiers. His actual tomb chamber remains unexcavated, sealed under a massive earthen mound. From the outside, it looks like a broad, truncated hill. Remote sensing and historical texts suggest a structured, perhaps stepped interior, a constructed mountain over an artificial underworld. Whether we call it a pyramid, a barrow, or a tumulus, the logic is again familiar. The ruler lies at the center of a raised geometric mass, his grave anchored in an artificial elevation. Scattered across islands in the Pacific, in places like Tahiti and elsewhere in Polynesia, Stone platforms called marae served as open-air temples and meeting grounds. Low compared to Giza or Teotihuacan, they nonetheless share the same basic grammar, a levelled, often stepped base, sometimes with upright stones at one end, demarcating a sacred zone raised above the ordinary ground. Here, chiefs and priests conducted rites, made offerings, and tied their genealogies to specific elevated points in the landscape. And still later, in the 19th century, on the floodplain of what is now South Sudan, a Nuer prophet named Ngundeng Bong began to raise his own mountain. Around 1870, he and his followers started piling earth and ashes into a tall conical mound, ringed with elephant tusks and crowned with ritual objects. By the time it was finished, the Ngundeng Pyramid stood perhaps 15 to 20 meters high, about 300 feet around at its base. For decades, it functioned as a sacred and political center, a physical embodiment of prophecy and identity, until British colonial forces deliberately damaged it in the 1920s. This is not ancient in the way we usually use the word. It is recent enough for photographs, for memories passed down only a few generations, and yet the form, a piled-up, conical, almost pyramidal mound, used as a focus of communal power, fits into the same long lineage as the desert platforms of Corral, the adobe huacas of the Moche, the earthen terraces of Cahokia. Why then do so many of these monuments feel invisible in the popular imagination? Part of it is simple physics. Stone keeps its edges. Earth and adobe soften. Rain rounds corners, wind blurs profiles. A limestone pyramid in a dry desert can hold its sharp silhouette for 4,000 years. A mud brick or dirt platform in a wetter climate can slump into a gentle rise in a few centuries. Without excavation, a great mound can look like nothing more than a natural hill. Part of it is the history of who wrote the earlier guidebooks. For centuries, accounts of world architecture were filtered through colonial perspectives that privileged carved stone, written inscriptions and traditions connected, directly or indirectly, to Europe and the Near East. Earthen monuments in the Americas and Africa were often described as primitive or crude, if they were mentioned at all. Their very materials were taken as proof that they were less sophisticated, less intentional. Yet when archaeologists take these structures seriously, surveying them, mapping them, excavating their fill, the same hallmarks of complexity appear: careful orientation, repeated construction phases, evidence of region-wide labor mobilization, offerings placed in foundation layers, sometimes even astronomical alignments. In technical terms, an adobe platform or a packed earth mound is no less an achievement of planning and communal organization than a sandstone terrace. It is simply made from what was at hand, and so our map of pyramids and pyramid-like forms has grown again. We have stone ziggurats on Mesopotamian plains, step pyramids on the Nile, stacked platforms in Mesoamerican cities, temple tombs in Maya jungles, adobe mountains on the Andean coast, earthen terraces on Midwestern floodplains, burial hills in China, stone marae in Polynesia, a prophetic mound in South Sudan. Many other civilizations never built such things at all. Others left only small hints. But from Peru to Illinois, from the Yellow River to the Pacific atolls, cultures that never exchanged engineers or scriptures still converged on the idea of lifting Earth into ordered geometric heights. What exactly were they all reaching for? A stairway for the dead? A throne for the gods? A stage for the living? Or something that slips between all three? To get closer to an answer, we have to step back from the bricks and baskets of soil and ask a more abstract question. What did these people think a pyramid actually did? If we start with the most obvious answer, the one carved into stone and written in spells, many pyramids were for the dead. Along the Nile and into Nubia, that point is relatively clear. Old Kingdom Egyptian pyramids, Kushite pyramids at Napata and Meroe, These are royal and elite tombs. Somewhere under the mass of masonry there is, or was, a burial chamber. Sarcophagus, grave goods, offerings. In Egypt, the pyramid is only one piece in a larger mortuary landscape. Valley temple, causeway, mortuary temple, subsidiary tombs, all arranged to service the king's ongoing cult. But even here, where the evidence is richest, the pyramid is not just a giant grave marker. When you read the pyramid texts, those dense poetic spells carved inside the later Old Kingdom pyramids, it becomes clear that the structure is meant to do something. Again and again, the texts speak of ascent. The dead king climbs to the sky. He mounts on the smoke of incense, ascends on the ladder of the gods, joins the imperishable stars. Sometimes the imagery is literal, steps, rungs, a ramp of light. Sometimes it is more fluid. The king becomes a falcon, a star, a beam of sunlight. The stone mass above him is not only covering, it is a launch platform, a stairway or perhaps a fossilized ray fixed in place to connect the dark chamber below with the bright, unsetting stars of the northern sky. That stairway to heaven theme does not stay confined to the Nile. In Mesopotamia, no royal body lies inside the ziggurat. These step towers are anchored to temple complexes, and their uppermost stage is usually crowned with a small shrine, a house for the god. Their very names tell you the intention. Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Iana's ziggurat at Uruk, house of heaven. High priests ascend the stairs. The god is believed to descend to meet them. The tower becomes the intermediate zone where divine and human realms touch. Later writers, looking at these towers, add another layer. From their summits, you can watch the sky. The higher you go, the less your view is blocked by walls and dust, the more clearly certain stars and planets track across the horizon. Whether or not they were purpose-built observatories in our modern sense, the connection between height gods and the ordered motions of the heavens was hard to miss. Half a world away in Mesoamerica, the ascent is steeper, but the logic is similar. At Teotihuacan, at Tikal, at countless Maya and central Mexican sites, pyramids support temples on their summits. Broad staircases run up their faces, often so steep that climbing them feels almost like scaling a cliff. Iconography and later indigenous traditions speak of a layered cosmos, watery or chthonic realms below. The human plane at the surface, multiple heavens above. The pyramid concentrates that vertical structure into one form. Caves or tunnels beneath stand in for the underworld. The plaza is the earthly stage. The temple at the top, reached by hard, breathless climbing, marks the point nearest the sky, where offerings burn and gods are addressed. In all three regions, separated by oceans and millennia, you see the same metaphor made literal. Build a staircase so the world can be climbed. Give the gods somewhere to come down to, the dead somewhere to go up, the living somewhere elevated to stand in between. In Egypt, there is another layer tied specifically to light. Early pyramids are stepped. Their outlines echo the idea of a stair. But by the time of Snefru and his son Khufu, the steps are smoothed into continuous faces. Later, Egyptian texts and temple traditions connect this form to the Ben-Ben, the primeval mound on which the sun god Ra first rose. In the temple city of Heliopolis, the Ben-Ben was embodied in a sacred stone, probably with a pointed pyramidal top. The little capstones that once crowned the great pyramids, pyramidions, were called Ben-Bené. They were often carved to resemble miniature obelisks, and there are good reasons to think they were once sheathed in gleaming material, polished stone or metal, to catch and flash sunlight. In that reading, the pyramid is not just a ladder. It is a solidified ray, a frozen sunbeam striking down onto the western desert. The dead king inside does not simply climb to the stars, he rises with the sun, ferried across the sky with Ra, reborn each dawn. The shape itself, sloping faces converging to a sharp, radiant apex, becomes a diagram of solar theology. Royal tomb, stairway, sun ray. Already, in this single culture, the monument is doing several jobs at once. Elsewhere, the functions braid together in different proportions. Some Maya pyramids contain royal burials, others do not, serving primarily as platforms for temples and as backgrounds for public ritual. Many Andean wakas seem to have been layered over earlier structures, incorporating burials but also hosting processions, sacrifices, and elite residences. The earthen platform of Monk's Mound at Cahokia probably supported a large building used by a paramount leader or priest, surrounded by plazas where gatherings took place and alignments marked the solstices. In these cases, the pyramid or platform is as much a stage as a tomb, a piece of political architecture that makes hierarchy visible in 3 dimensions. Standing at the base, you look up and see who is allowed to stand above you. That, too, seems to be a constant. Pyramids are conspicuous claims on space. They are central, elevated, and hard to ignore. To plan and complete one, a community has to mobilize enormous labor. Quarry stone, mold bricks, carry soil in baskets, cut and haul timbers. It takes organizers, specialists, feeding systems. It takes a story compelling enough that people are willing to spend harvest seasons and dry months lifting heavy things for a purpose that does not immediately fill their own granaries. When the thing is finished, its bulk silently proves that such organization exists. It says, there are rulers here who can command work on this scale. There are gods or ancestors here who deserve it. There is a center around which your smaller lives orbit. At the same time, many pyramids also seem to encode more abstract kinds of order. Alignments are one clue. Egyptian pyramids in the Old Kingdom show careful orientation to the cardinal directions. Their sides track north-south, east to west with surprising precision. Some Mesoamerican pyramids and mounds line up with solstice sunrises or particular star risings. Wooden post circles at sites like Cahokia mark equinoxes and solstices in relation to platform mounds. It is easy to slip into numerology here, to see alignments everywhere, but even the cautious evidence suggests that architects were thinking about how their artificial mountains sat within a larger celestial geometry. So, what were they really for? Tombs, certainly, in many cases, temples in others, stages for coronations, war captives, offerings, prophecies, symbols of solar cycles, mountains of creation, world trees in stone, political manifestos in baked brick and earth. You can list the functions, sort them into tidy categories: funerary, cultic, astronomical, ideological. But on the ground they bleed into one another, and sometimes the puzzle pieces do not fit cleanly at all. Egypt's little provincial pyramids, scattered along the Nile with no internal chambers and no obvious burials, still resist easy explanation. Were they cenotaphs, symbolic tombs for a king who lay elsewhere, markers of royal presence in distant nomes, miniature versions of the Great Pyramids, broadcast antennas of ideology more than functioning mortuaries? The evidence is fragmentary. The debates continue. In Mesoamerica, too, individual pyramids carry unique histories. Some were rebuilt again and again, new layers encasing old, each phase adjusting orientations, staircases, and associated plazas. The meaning of any one stage of that construction might have shifted with political change, with new dynasties, with local theological innovation. To ask, what was this pyramid for, may be like asking what a cathedral, a royal palace, and a graveyard are really for when they are all stitched into a single hill. So perhaps the better question is not, what were pyramids for, in the singular. But what did this particular community need a pyramid to do? From that angle, a pattern emerges that is less mysterious, but no less profound. When societies reach a certain scale and complexity, when leaders need to anchor their authority and their gods in something tangible, when calendars and rituals and burial customs have to be synchronized across many villages and fields, they often turn to the same simple, stable solution. Pile material high in a shape that will not easily fall down, a broad base, tapering sides, stepped or smooth. Gravity approves. So does the imagination. A pyramid is a mountain you can design. It offers terraces for rites, a summit for shrines, internal spaces for the dead, flanks for processions, a silhouette that can be seen for miles and that naturally invites stories about what lies at its top and inside its core. It weaves the underworld, the human world and the sky into a single climbable object. Not every civilization chose this path. Many did not. Those that did gave the form their own languages, gods and politics. The similarities are not proof of some lost global blueprint. They are a kind of architectural rhyme, born from shared constraints of physics, society and belief. And yet, even once you have listed the functions and traced the convergences, a final question lingers. How exactly did people without engines or steel convince whole populations to spend years shaping mountains by hand? What did it feel like to take part in such a project, to quarry, to haul, to lift, in service of a shape that would outlast you by thousands of years? To answer that, we have to leave the realm of theology and geometry and step into the dust of building sites, work gangs on the Nile floodplain, brickmakers on Andean terraces, basket lines in Midwestern summers. We have to look at how these impossible structures were actually raised, stone by stone and basket by basket, and what those construction efforts reveal about the societies behind the slopes. To get there, we have to change the question. Not why did they build these things, but how do you even start? Because the how is not just engineering trivia. It is a window into what these societies were and what they were becoming while the stones were rising. Imagine for a moment that you are not the king commissioning a pyramid or the priest explaining its rituals, but one of the thousands of people whose hands actually move the material. You wake in a crowded barracks south of the Giza Plateau, in a place modern archaeologists call Hayt el Ghurab. Outside, in the grey before dawn, the air smells of baking bread and brewing beer. The old picture of pyramid builders was simple, anonymous slaves driven by whips, half-starved in the desert. But the ground at Giza says something more complicated, and in some ways more impressive. When Mark Lerner, Zahi Hawass, and their teams peeled back the sand, they found not a scatter of temporary huts, but a planned town. Long galleries where hundreds of men could sleep, courtyards with huge bread ovens, breweries, kitchens, a copper workshop for tools. An area that looks, in function if not in name, like a hospital, rooms with evidence of medical care. In the cemeteries beside this workers' village, skeletons show the story written in bone. Spines compressed from heavy lifting, arthritic knees, broken limbs that had been set and healed. These people worked brutally hard, but they were fed on bread, beef, and fish. They had access to treatment. They were not disposable. Inside the Great Pyramid's relieving chambers, on hidden blocks never meant to be seen, workers left graffiti, informal ink sketches, quick carvings. They named their crews. Friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure. These are not the labels of chained captives. They sound much more like teams, gangs with pride and a sense of competition. You can almost hear the banter in the quarry, the arguments over whose gang hauled more blocks this season. But where did all these people come from? In Egypt, the answer seems to lie with the river itself. Every year the Nile rose and flooded the fields. For months farmland lay under water. You could not plough. You could not harvest. What you had, if the inundation was good, was time, and a lot of idle, strong backs. Old Kingdom kings tapped into that slack season with a system modern scholars call corvée labour. Villages along the Nile owed the state a certain number of workers for a certain span. Those men came to royal projects. Quarries, canals, temples, pyramids were housed, fed, and then rotated back home. Administrative texts from later periods, which likely preserve older patterns, record rations of grain and beer, lists of work parties, overseers tallying who showed up and who did not. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a redistribution machine. Grain collected as tax turns into bread and beer, flows into the mouths of workers, and comes back transmuted as limestone courses and granite beams. Scholars like Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia have pushed this idea further. In their view, the pyramid was not just a product of a strong state. It was one of the engines that made the state strong in the first place. If you are going to move millions of stones, you have to know how many people you can summon, how much food they will need, how far supplies must travel, which routes flood, which quarries yield which rock. You have to keep records, standardize units, appoint trustworthy officials, punish theft, resolve disputes. Do that for one king's monument and you have, almost accidentally, trained a bureaucracy. The building site becomes a kind of laboratory for statecraft. Officials learn which village can actually send 200 men in a season and which only 50. Royal authority, which might once have been just a presence in a distant palace, now arrives as scribes and overseers standing in your fields, counting your harvest, measuring your labour. When the pyramid is finished, the stone mountain is visible proof of divine kingship. But the less visible legacy is the network of administrators, storage depots, and expectations that will outlast that king and serve the next. This pattern, the pyramid as state-making project, shows up with local variations far from Egypt. In Mesoamerica, we do not have Nile floods, but we do have city-states and tribute. Places like Teotihuacan, Tikal, or later Aztec Tenochtitlan sat at the center of webs of smaller towns and villages. Tribute flowed in, maize, cacao, textiles, obsidian, labor. When a new pyramid was ordered, a temple platform expanded, a stairway rebuilt, an older structure encased in fresh masonry. Rulers could command workers from subject communities, directed by local nobles and overseen by central authorities. The construction techniques fit that political ecology. Rather than quarrying and precisely dressing huge blocks as Egyptians did, many Mesoamerican builders used rubble or earth cores, held in place by stone retaining walls and finished with clay and lime plaster. At Teotihuacan, engineers laid out construction cells, compartments filled with stone and soil, then bound everything together with lime-rich mortar and smooth painted surfaces. It is fast, modular building. You can mobilize many small teams, each filling and tamping their own segment, all under the gaze of temple priests and palace officials. Hundreds of hands, tens of thousands of basket loads, slowly push the mountain of fill higher. Tribute is not just something you hand over once a year. It becomes written into the vertical profile of the city. North in the Mississippi River Valley at Cahokia, the logic shifts again but still rhymes. Here there is no writing to tell us the titles of the overseers, no stone faces of kings to name, but there is earth, piled into more than 100 mounds. Monk's Mound, the largest, rises 30 meters and covers roughly 6 hectares. Built in at least 14 stages, it contains millions of cubic feet of soil moved basket by basket. Archaeologists see in this scale a powerful chiefdom, leaders who could call people from surrounding farmsteads, organize work parties, stage feasts, and turn communal labor into something sacred and political. Alignments with wooden post circles suggest that mound building was keyed to calendar events, solstices, equinoxes, tying the cycles of the sky to the authority of those who commanded the work. Again, the act of building is not separate from power. It is one of its main expressions. And in the Andes, where the earth shakes, you can watch engineering adjusting to a landscape that does not sit still. Coastal builders there developed a technique that archaeologists call shikra, mesh bags filled with stones, each one a standard size and weight. These bags were stacked as internal fill-in stepped platforms. When earthquakes hit, the shikra acted like an ancient shock absorber. Instead of rigid masonry cracking along clean lines, the bagged fill settled and shifted, dispersing energy, keeping the overall shape intact. It is a quiet kind of genius. No inscriptions boast of it. But it tells you that the people piling these platforms were not just following a sacred template. They were observing, learning from collapse, iterating solutions over generations of construction. Mesopotamian ziggurat builders faced a different constraint, a shortage of good stone. Their mountains are brick, not rock. Sun-dried mud brick for the mass, baked bricks and bitumen mortar for faces and corners where weather bites hardest. To keep these towers from melting back into the plain, they developed complex drainage, buttressing, and stages of periodic rebuilding, each new king leaving his inscription, his layer, on a shared, slowly changing core. Across all these regions, one thing remains stubbornly elusive. We can outline the materials, identify quarries, estimate workforces, but for many of the grandest pyramids, we still do not know every trick. In Egypt, where the evidence is best, debates over ramps for the Great Pyramid continue. A long straight ramp, consuming as much material as the pyramid itself. A spiral up the exterior, an internal ramp corkscrewing through the structure. Some combination, adapted as the height rose. Recent discoveries at the Hatnub alabaster quarries give us a concrete piece of the puzzle. There, carved into the desert, is a steep ramp flanked by stairways and post holes. Archaeologists think workers hauled stone blocks up the central ramp on sleds, using ropes looped around wooden posts to multiply their pulling force. The slope could be far steeper than a simple earthen ramp allows. It is an elegant system, and it proves that Old Kingdom Egyptians had the tools and knowledge to move heavy blocks up sharp inclines. Does that mean the Great Pyramid was built exactly this way? Not necessarily. The quarry ramp is an analogy, not a blueprint. Different projects, different constraints may have called for different solutions, and no ancient architect left us a master manual to settle the matter. Maybe that lingering uncertainty is fitting. Even where we can trace every sherd of pottery and every alignment of brick, there is an element of these constructions that resists complete translation. The experience of thousands of individuals coordinated into something vaster than any one of them could see from ground level. What did it feel like, years into a reign, to look up from the floodplain and realize that the thing you'd been helping to build now towered above your village, casting its own geometry against the sky? What stories did people tell themselves and each other to make the weight of stones and baskets feel worth bearing? Those questions lead us back from logistics to meaning, from supply chains to symbols. Because once the last load of earth is tamped down, once the last stone is levered into place, the monument is not just an engineering achievement. It is a presence that demands interpretation. And that is where myths, misreadings, and modern fascinations begin to accumulate layer by layer around these ancient slopes. When you pile that much stone, that much earth in one place, you do not just bend the landscape, you bend imagination. People standing in the shadow of these structures 1,000 years after they were built were just as struck dumb as we are. They too craned their necks, felt the weight of the thing in their chest and asked, who could possibly have done this? That question is the seed from which an entire forest of stories has grown. In medieval Egypt, Muslims and Christians lived among the ruins of Giza with no surviving Egyptian text to explain them. The old hieroglyphic language had been forgotten. The builders themselves had been gone for nearly 2,000 years. So new histories formed. One of the most famous centres on a mysterious king called Surid ibn Salhuk. In these Arabic and Coptic tales, Surid dreams of catastrophe. The stars fall from the sky. The earth pitches and splits. A flood is coming, or fire, or both. Warned by this vision and by wise astrologers, he orders the construction of the pyramids as vast vaults against the end of the world. Into them, the stories say, he places everything his civilization knows. Books of astronomy, records of medicine, maps of the heavens, instruments of gold and glass, even corpses preserved in strange fluids, waiting for some future age to learn from them. When the deluge comes, the same flood that sweeps across the pages of Genesis and the Quran, the pyramids stand. Afterward they are like stone-time capsules, holding the knowledge of the antediluvian world. You can hear, under the legend, the echo of real experience. People in Fatimid and Mamluk Cairo could not read the temple walls, but they could see that the stones were older than any building they knew, that they shrugged off earthquake and sandstorm. It made sense to imagine them as the last survivors of a world erased, to fold them into a sacred story already shared across religions. Centuries later, in 19th century Europe, another silence opened. Not the loss of all knowledge this time, but a gap between what archaeologists could say and what some people wanted the pyramids to mean. Hieroglyphs were just beginning to be deciphered. Egyptology was in its childhood. Into that half-lit space stepped a Scottish astronomer named Charles Piazzi Smith. Smith was not content with the idea that the Great Pyramid was just a tomb. In long, intricate works, he argued that its dimensions encoded the length of the year, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, even a God-given unit of measurement, the pyramid inch. He traced internal passages and claimed they mapped out a prophetic timeline of world history, with bends and chambers marking key biblical events and future upheavals. Scientific societies rolled their eyes and rejected his numerology. But outside those circles his ideas caught fire. Pamphlets spread. Bible study groups measured diagrams and counted off inches in the Queen's chamber, looking for the date of the end times. A monument that had outlived every pharaoh became, in some imaginations, a stone calendar ticking toward revelation. The 20th century brought a new twist. In 1968, a Swiss hotel manager named Erich von Däniken published a book with a teasing question mark in its title, Chariots of the Gods. His answer was simple and sensational. The pyramids of Egypt, the stepped temples of Mesoamerica, the Nazca lines in Peru, the massive stones of Baalbek, all, he claimed, were not the work of ancient peoples alone. They were landing pads, beacons, or gifts from visitors from the stars. Extraterrestrials, he suggested, had taught our ancestors how to quarry, how to lift, how to shape. The proof, he argued, lay in the sheer scale of these works. Primitive humans, he insisted, could not possibly have managed them. Archaeologists pointed out the missing pieces. No alien tools, no non-human artifacts, plenty of human ones. Copper chisels, dolerite pounders, stone hammers, wooden sledges. Quarry marks halfway down the sides of unfinished obelisks. Workers' villages and cemeteries, layered construction, fills and repairs, exactly what you would expect from people learning and adjusting over generations. They also noted something more uncomfortable. The idea that ancient Egyptians, Maya or Andean builders could not have engineered their own monuments does not float in a vacuum. It draws, often unconsciously, on colonial and Eurocentric habits of thought. the assumption that complex mathematics and large-scale organization are Western properties, that brown and black civilizations need outside help to reach engineering heights. But von Däniken's book, and the TV specials and imitators that followed, tapped into a powerful current of desire, the wish for the extraordinary to break into the ordinary, for secret knowledge, hidden in plain sight, to be waiting if only you look sideways at the stones. Today, that impulse has migrated again. On social media, short clips confidently declare that the pyramids emit energy, or that their angles match mysterious grids stretching across the globe. Some posts recycle old 19th century pyramidology with new graphics. Others splice together drone footage of Mesoamerican temples with talk of ancient power plants, forgotten advanced civilizations, lost technologies. Why do these narratives keep coming back? Part of it is visual. A pyramid does not need translation. You do not have to know the language or the local gods to feel its presence. The form is elemental, a mountain with its chaos shaved into clean lines. From the ground, it looks like something that should not exist, especially if your daily experience of building is putting up a fence or mending a roof. Part of it is intuitive difficulty. If you stand before the Great Pyramid and someone tells you it contains over 2 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as a small truck, your mind balks. The image of a handful of clever overseers, a few tricks with ropes and ramps and tens of thousands of ordinary workers does not feel like enough. Our brains like causes that match effects. Monumental stones suggest monumental explanations, and part of it is history. For a long time, accounts of the ancient world were written through colonial lenses. Indigenous knowledge was dismissed. Local traditions about how things were built were ignored or overwritten. Credit for civilization was quietly moved north and west. In that vacuum, alternative stories flourished. If official narratives seemed to say, these people were backward, and the structures in front of you clearly were not, then radical reinterpretations, a pre-flood superculture, a race of lost engineers, visitors from space, could feel like a kind of corrective, even if they replaced one kind of erasure with another. Against all of this, archaeology does not offer a single thunderclap revelation. It offers something slower and in its own way more astonishing, cumulative detail. Trenches cut into the Giza Plateau reveal chalky quarry scars where blocks were pried from bedrock. At Meroe in Sudan, broken tools and half-finished chapels cluster around steep, narrow pyramids that we can track phase by phase. In the Valley of Mexico at Teotihuacan, layers of plaster and fill show how a temple was widened, raised, encased, remodeled. At Andean sites, shikra bags still sit where workers stacked them, their woven fibres surviving in dry soil. Written records, where we have them, speak of mustered workers, rations of grain, lists of deliveries. Graffiti inside Egyptian pyramids tracks the progress of crew gangs with almost casual pride. The footprints left in drying bricks at Mesopotamian ziggurats belong to humans, not anything stranger. None of this solves every puzzle. We still do not have a universally accepted blueprint for how Khufu's builders managed the highest courses of the Great Pyramid, only models supported to different degrees by evidence like the Hatnub quarry ramp. We still argue over the full theological meanings of specific angles, chamber layouts and alignments. How much is solar symbolism? How much stellar? How much political theatre turned into stone? At Teotihuacan, we still do not know the language of the city's planners, the names they gave their pyramids, or the precise reasons the city was burned and partly abandoned. In the Mississippi Valley, we can map mound stages but not recite the myths that once explained their sequence. Across cultures, pyramid-building traditions start abruptly, transform, then cease. The last Kushite pyramids rise centuries after Egypt's royal building has stopped. The Maya keep renovating temple platforms even as some cities are being abandoned. Elsewhere, the fashion for vertical monuments fades into other kinds of sacred architecture. Those genuine unknowns are different from the total blankness imagined by nobody knows anything narratives. They sit on top of a thick base of knowledge about quarries and labour, about timelines,